there is no intended visual difference between a fully constructed product and a light source in an architectural detail. You don't need, 12,000 different types of slot products that meet every single potential option in order to do good work.
Design always reflects culture, right? And culture is a reflection of politics. I want to take a step back and then think about design and if I really need it in a project. Am I doing it because it's cool and I want to test it out and I see how it looks, or am I doing it because it actually is in service of my lighting design application?
Bill Lamb had a great quote from his book that was basically we don't need more technology and we don't need more light. What we need is people to understand the principles of perception and how to apply the lighting technologies already at our disposal.
The invention of tape lights suddenly changed the non-detail game because we started seeing so many architectural details.
The most sustainable detail is one in which the detail can exist independent of whatever manufacturer's thing is in there, right?
Does a particular manufacturer need to come up with a new fixture every week? This is not freaking Forever 21, right? No matter how much we keep evolving lighting design, there's always going to be a need to go back to less. I think we need to take a step back as designers and really think about our spaces, be critical, intentional with why we are putting a light fixture. And then if we are only using 5 fixture types in our project, then that's going to reflect on the manufacturing industry too.
Welcome to the Light Pod, built by Light-Eye, the #1 podcast for thought-provoking and inspirational conversations when it comes to the people, the process, and the programming behind design, all with a little love for lighting to go along with it. I'm your host, Sam Corbel, and today we welcome Srushti Totadri and Dan Weissman to the podcast, both lighting designers at Lam Partners. Dan, welcome back to the podcast. Srushti, welcome to the podcast. There's a strong history of using light in the environments that humans exist within, of which light has been detailed out a certain way, whether that's intentional or unintentional, or everywhere, all the time.
Close.
And you both have your own journeys into lighting, but you also have one thing in common, which is you both studied architecture and have a very dynamic look into how you approach what you do today, which is designing exquisite luminous spaces with light. A line from Dan Weissman in the documentary that we filmed back in 2020. If you haven't seen it, just check it out. It's on the Light-Eye YouTube channel. Before we dive into the concrete nature of what we want to discuss today, I think one of the most important things is to discuss where you came up with this idea and why it's an important thing to sort of unpack.
Yeah, our topic is called Integrated, a Cultural History of Coves, Slots, and Planes. I think one place where we started talking about this was when on every client call, we had the architect not know what a slot was or kept calling a cove a slot and slot a cove. So every meeting we were trying to explain the difference between the two. And then I think that's where we started talking about it, and we were like, oh, we should do a presentation on this.
Well, where do these details come from? What is the history of integrated lighting details? Because they're not an inevitability, right? They don't exist in major form before electric lighting. And then all of a sudden, within the course of a couple decades, they became a huge factor of architectural expression.
When you talk about people being confused on what a lighting detail is versus the nature of just pure simplistic architectural expression, there's a sentiment that I've heard a lot, and I think lighting design often caters to, which is, it's our job to enhance that architecture. It's our job to bring that architecture to life. How would you say when you look at the context of how these details have been developed and where it came from, is that true to the sense that lighting helps shape that architecture or vice versa? Like, what's the relationship that you feel this conversation comes to us with?
Yeah, I think in the current practice, architects know that coves are a lighting detail and they should have it in a project and it's good. But I don't think they understand the lighting effect and the quality of light that you get from it. So a lot of times in projects, they know that they have to give us a cove, but they don't know why they're doing it. So I think, a big part of our design process is really telling them like where to use it and what it really does to the space by putting that in there. So I think without, we're calling coves slots as non-details because they go away in a space. They're not a detail that you can look at. Without these non-details, it's not possible to perceive architectural materials. So I think it's like it forms the space, like it reveals the architecture.
It's really the question of the provision of ambient lighting. So like indirect light that's illuminating surfaces as opposed to object light where it's a lamp in a space that is illuminating the space around it, but it's also an object that is both like it's a thing to look at in space. It's got a visual presence. It's got some sort of motific detailing that is creating some sort of, design element, like the light fixtures here, like that's got some painting on it and some frilly things that like give it a certain aesthetic versus what we're deeming as a non-detail is really the light integrated into an architectural form in such a way that all you're seeing is the effect of the light in space or highlighting architectural forms or materials as opposed to an object, which would be sort of the opposite, like a positive detail or just a fixture that's sitting on the ground.
Would it be fair to simplify that down to it's obvious that there's something creating that illumination versus there's just an experience of it being illuminated?
Yeah, I think the simplified way of saying it is light as object and lighted objects. Yeah. So that's how we distinguish the two types of lights we provide in a space. Yeah.
Imagine a pendant fixture where you can see the canopy, you see the suspension mounts, you see the aircraft cable. That's showing you how that thing is mounted and suspended. You've got a representational detail, so something like light fixtures in Unity Temple, for example, that Frank Lloyd Wright did. Those cube fixtures are representational of sort of a motif that he's using throughout the building and creating a formal language throughout his architectural piece of which lighting is helping to reinforce. And does it need to be a cube in order to do its luminous work? No, of course not, but it's got something representational about it. And the third would be an abstract detail that is not really showing you what it is. It's the non-detail or a negative detail. The fourth one is would be called an autonomous detail. So like Alvar Aalto's handles in his famous buildings where they have nothing to do with anything in the architecture. And you could say like, well, there's a lot of decorative pendants that are pretty autonomous.
Yeah, the decorative pendant in the meeting room is
about as autonomous as it gets for lighting design. So that's sort of the framing mechanism that we've been using to think about this idea.
They all have a similar origin in that once the lamp was started, when they started, when the incandescent lamps started getting more efficient and more bright, I think people started realizing that even though this technology was really cool, it's very uncomfortable. Like people were experiencing glare. There were actually a ton of people complaining of headaches. So I think in the late 1800s, a lot of eye doctors and oculists were very frustrated with these direct lights. There were surgeons who didn't like how much light they had over their table. And then all these complaints were heard by the different illuminating engineers. And then they started thinking of ways to either using shades or reflectors start concealing these light fixtures, just so that they became more palatable in spaces. So it went from there into, I think a lot of historic buildings already came with natural elements like trims, crown molding. So it became very, these details like that were positive details in architecture became the installation detail for the negative or the non-detail with lighting. So I think
Well, that actually, just real quick, that's a really interesting point that we hadn't even really talked about, which is a crown molding is quite literally a positive detail to cover the intersection of the wall and ceiling that may have some imperfections in that construction. And by putting a cove light in that detail, it turns what is a positive detail in architectural sense into a negative detail in the lighting sense.
Yeah, and then the reverse of that is we use these non-details so much and so often and in various architectural elements nowadays that we are now turning this non-detail into a motific or an ornament by just like overusing it in space. So this is how we're like kind of trying to bring this vicious cycle of how the non-detail started, but now how it's used.
A couple other threads to tease at are, and you mentioned this in our pre-discussion about like the replication of nature, and there is the long-standing fascination of trying to make interior spaces feel more like outside. So we show historic examples like a room at Versailles painted with a grand sky scene with cherubs and other, fantastical creatures, but it's ultimately trying to make it look like the ceiling is the sky. And I think in the same way, we find that early, skylight details of continuous glazed surfaces, like the Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in the 1850s, or Bruno Taut's the Glass Pavilion. These projects trying to sort of think about crystallization of the natural environment. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of examples from early history are the non-details that we see with solar, like passive solar strategies. So clear story windows, skylights, these all, like the current day coves and backlit planes are really mimicking those details that were introduced in order to bring daylight into a space.
The difference between a light fixture and a lighting detail, at least and we've sort of talked about this a little, is a lighting detail is how does a light source permanently meet architecture, right? Like if it's just a lamp that's sitting on the floor and plugged in, that's not really a lighting detail, that's just a light fixture. Even if it's maybe a sconce on the wall, it might not really be a lighting detail, even though there's a junction box behind it. It's more just like a light fixture. But as soon as you start to mold the architecture in some way, even minimally, to accept that light, then you start to think about a lighting detail. So a great example is like niches in old churches that would hold a candle, right? That niche was designed for that candle. Before electric lighting, stages would have a row of first candles, then gas lamps, but with a big shield in front of each of those elements, so that from the audience's perspective, all they're seeing is the effect of the light on the actors. Now we're at the turn of the century. We've got the development of consumer culture in the rise of storefront design. You've got the development of the development of electric light sources and fixtures. As early as 1906, 1907, there's the first drawn examples of cove lighting that the IES in its nascent years published. And then World War I happens, and everything sort of goes on hiatus for a moment. But after World War I, there's this whole new development, particularly in Northern Europe, that really starts to explode the development of lighting details. And this is something that I've been finding really interested in and went on a complete deep dive on, which was the Weimar Republic development of, in particular, movie theaters. First theaters, but then the movie theater as sort of this fundamentally new architectural type, and the coincident development of both German film and German movie theaters supporting the aesthetic of the films. In the United States, early movie theaters might have, did a lot of ornate elements. Like there was a theater near where I grew up that was called the Oriental that had all this sort of fantastical detailing, but the lighting was, positive details of motific, exactly. But in Germany, after the war, there wasn't a lot of money, and so they wanted to build things quickly, and they found that the use of light was a way of both sort of having a synthesis with the movie, which was literally a medium of light, and the architecture. And this sort of came to a head with Erich Mendelsohn in the late 1920s in a theater in Berlin, and then a whole range of other ones that all sort of proliferated in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and then a lot of them were destroyed during World War II.
I think it's really interesting how each significant political movement like World War I, World War II gave rise to a very specific type of non-detail, because after World War II, we saw a lot of German architects immigrate into the US, and then we see the birth of the wall slot seen in like residences of like Gropius. And then there's this whole thread between the Cold War and the space race to like seeing the coves be more integrated into transportation, like planes and trains, and this like very
sort of futuristic
aesthetic. Futuristic aesthetic of incorporating different types of non-details to like showcase everyone's like look towards what the future could be with the space race.
Yeah. How do you think something goes from, well, I'm inspired by it and it was done here, to, well, now I'm going to make it cool, new, and different?
Well, I think one other salient factor, and maybe this is going to play into your question, is the use of photography and publications, because a lot of, before literally the entire modernist movement in Germany immigrated to the United States, there was a proliferation of photography and publications coming out of Northern Europe with all this the new architecture, the new building they called it, that young architecture students and architects in the U.S. were like totally eating up, and were just had this thirst for it. And there, a lot of those architects went and lectured and did the lecture circuit throughout much of America.
Something happens, people see it, they're like, oh, that's cool, I'm going to replicate it because it was effective, it was efficient. There's a number of reasons, but it has a positive outcome for its current use, and therefore, in this instance, it was replicated maybe in the same use over and over, and then all of a sudden, they wanted to take something they were doing and push it into a new application because they were inspired by.
Design always reflects culture, right? And culture is a reflection of politics. So I think it's a cycle. So first a political event or a movement that changes cultural perception happens, and then movies, art, writing, literature all emerge as a response to that completely new thread in history. And then once there's writing and movies about it, architecture starts responding to art and movies and writing. And so I think it's a vicious cycle. And then when architecture starts going in a certain direction, then movies start getting shot in those backdrops. So I think that's a constant vicious cycle, and that cycle is always disrupted, again, like when something like COVID. When COVID happened, again, there was like a completely different thread. We started looking at UV lights suddenly. So I think there's always a cycle, and then something disrupts a cycle, and then everything picks up from there.
I mean, what we've been interested in is both like, how is the non-detail in lighting both like sort of an element that's independent of any outside forces, but also completely engaged in the way in which architectural production happens. I mean, so far I've only talked about sort of all the consumerist, capitalist threads of this, but as you get into the 1970s, there is this now a whole new rise of understanding of what it means to have human perception as the leading factor in the development of a lighted environment. And the godfather of our esteemed practice, Bill Lam, was one of the major voices in the sort of pushing forward the idea that human perception should be the leading factor and not like motific elements.
Light follows perception. Yeah.
John Flynn worked on the Flynn modes, did a bunch of research on people's perception of space and how they felt. And that happened, I think he published his first paper in 73 and then followed it up with a couple more late in the 70s. So this became much more of a topic at this time. But thinking back to sort of the idea of like a perceptual environment versus a light levels based environment, you could have, 5 or 10 foot candles on on what's perceived as the task plane. But if your surround is well lighted, it might feel like a very bright space versus you could have 50, 60 foot candles on your task plane, but dark walls, and it feels like a dark space. And so he was very much of a leader in thinking about lighting the things you want to see, lighting vertical surfaces, lighting ceilings, using the ambient layer to sort of create that.
Lighting is so quantifiable. Like, it's easier to quantify light, to understand light in terms of foot candles and luminance, rather than try to understand it as how it makes you feel. And because of that, and I think till Bill Lam started questioning it, the IES and other engineering societies had been pushing the narrative of lighting more in a quantifiable manner, and then we finally had someone who came forward and said, I don't really agree with this. So he criticized the backlit ceiling.
The luminous ceiling is the epitome of this conversation, that it basically was the attempt to create a non-detail of uniform illuminance and luminance, uniform brightness, across an entire ceiling during an era where energy was plentiful. The
technology was exciting.
The electrical engineers were in collusion with the energy suppliers and the manufacturers, and so there was sort of this multi-headed way of trying to sell light. And the luminous ceiling was literally like
they were in collusion in the sense that they were told?
No, they were literally the electrical engineers, the power engineers, and the lighting manufacturers basically were all in on it together to sell light fixtures, to sell more electricity, to make money, to sell, so all for sales, right? And not in the best service of
perception. Yeah.
It came to a head in the late 1960s, and then the energy crisis sort of put it into it. I mean, so then what happened? Well, instead of a fully luminous surface, let's just space out those little luminous surfaces, and we'll call them 2x2 or 2x4 troffers, right? So now we've got this perfectly even lighting at the task plane, but with this highly patterned, visually dominant ceiling plane that does not lead to sort of give you the things that you want to see.
Yeah,
right?
It satisfied the foot candle levels, which was, I think, a big part of the conversation, right? If you achieve a certain light level, you're doing that. That meant good lighting design, versus perception was not really in the conversation. A space where somebody feels comfortable does not always correlate to the foot candle levels.
Do you know when the IES put out their first recommended practice publication in terms of light levels?
Not off the top of my head, but we have this graph that I've shown in many lectures that shows the ratcheted increase in recommended light levels in an office that get upwards of 170 foot candles. It's insane how much they're recommending by mid-century years. And then the energy crisis happens and the whole thing drops off. We did, however, pass over what a lot of people think of as the godfather of lighting design, which is Richard Kelly. Yeah. Play a very important role in all of this, for better or worse.
Yeah, I think he's one of the first recognizable names in the lighting design industry, right? We associate him to be one of the pioneers of a dedicated designer who thinks about lighting in a space, who's not an engineer.
Even though he definitely was not.
Yeah.
But in our contemporary practice, we think of him as that. He wasn't the first. There were figures dating back to the late 1800s that were dedicated to these.
As part of our research, we read a couple of books by Augustus Curtis and Matthew Laquiche, who wrote books on how concealed lighting is created. And Matthew Laquiche was actually referred to as the father of modern seeing. And we don't hear a lot about him in our current practice.
The place where lighting design really started was actually the exhibitions in the late 18 and early 1900s. So you've got the World's Fair in Chicago, the Columbian Exposition, the first illuminated fair. That's the Current Wars movie about Edison versus Westinghouse. And then over a period of a couple World's Fairs, you go from this light as object to lighted objects. And you can see this in photographs of those World's Fairs. The first ones, they're literally outlining buildings with light bulbs. And by the World's Fair in San Francisco in, I think, 1917, they're lighting all the forms of the buildings with spotlights.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how it took just 10 to 12 years for the non-detail to become so mainstream. So from when incandescent bulb was invented and actually commercialized, going from there to not seeing to concealed incandescent system, it just took 15, 20 years to do that.
Kelly used both non-details and positive details in an artistic and expressionistic way. And I think look at Seagram Building, for example. It's the one of the most famous wall slot details of the mid-century years around the elevator core, or not the first actually, but one of the most famous uses of the luminous ceiling in service of sort of the overall aesthetic of the building. I think he was doing it for real, honest, luminous reasons. But as most things go, when you transition from the first artistic statement to the explosion of
the trend.
Exactly.
Richard Kelly coined it a play of brilliance, right? So the way he introduced light and perception of light in his spaces had a reason and an intentionality to it. And then there were people who saw a luminous ceiling and in photographs and thought, oh, that's cool, I'll do that in my project too. And then it starts becoming a trend where people don't think about, does this space really need a luminous ceiling? Do we really provide a luminous ceiling to somebody who's working in a space for 12 hours?
Scientists were sort of implicit in furthering this. So Perry Moon and his wife Domina Spencer wrote a paper in the late 40s that basically developed the mathematical expressions for calculating the effects of luminous surfaces. And they were big supporters of this. And Perry Moon taught lighting at MIT, and Bill Lamb was actually a student of his. And literally in the preface to Perception of Lighting as Form Givers for Architecture, Bill is I don't understand why everybody likes this. I find them really uncomfortable. What's the big deal? Let's try something else.
And this is really where the entrance of perception of light comes onto the stage.
Other than the books that we read by Curtis and Laquiche, there was no real literature that celebrated perception and the quality of light. There's so much history associated with architecture, but there's nothing that talks about the way the light feels or the quality of light in a space. And I think with Richard Kelly, John Flynn, and Bill Lamb, they started actually describing what a well-lit space could feel like. And I think that conversation was so important for people to start understanding lighting design as a profession and how to incorporate it in our work. We started this conversation talking about lighting being a replicator of nature and the natural, and outside in nature we're not used to the same quality of light. Today in San Diego, we started with a very cloudy, diffuse sky, and then we got a brilliant sun for half an hour. And I think that's the we're used to the dynamism, but then when it comes to interior spaces, I feel like we try to create just this one-dimensional way of lighting. And I think having multiple layers of light and having the light quality change through the year, depending on the culture, the context in which it's present, the weather outside, I think that influences. We don't need to be prescribing a particular space to people.
Well, and I think this is yet another, I hate to say it, but a Richard Kelly quality of his three tenets that he came up with in the early 50s. You know, if you're just providing the non-detail by itself, that's basically the ambient luminescence, right? But people feel flat. You feel it can be kind of like an overcast sky. And so you need those other layers to give it that spark.
And this is where, as you referred to it, things like the non-detail are no longer circumstantial, but they're intentional.
Right. Well, and I think that it is an important inflection point where when you just have lighting being prescribed by electrical engineers or by non-lighting specialists, you get very flat or very one-dimensional solutions that may be lighted objects, or it may be
satisfying a quantitative.
A single basic, like monodimensional.
A lot of times we do daylighting, and a lot of times we try to talk to architects about including us in the daylighting conversation. They always show us these like plans that have the light levels in it, and then they think they're successful because they have optimized for getting a lot of sunlight in the space. And that's not always the case. Like there's so much potential in sunlight itself. So to think that you have designed daylight by just meeting the SDA requirements for LEED doesn't really make for a beautiful space that can inspire people that occupy the space.
So I think the development of lighting design as a profession, in a lot of ways, is the development of helping architects develop non-details as a part of their architectural expression. I think a lot of what Bill Lam did in his career was like helping
confront that.
Like, I mean, arguably is one of his most famous pieces of architecture is the DC Metro, which is like front and center non-detail, just lighting those concrete forms from a concealed source. So with all of this said, we now sort of are transitioning into the 21st century and the transition from legacy sources to LED. And we find ourselves in a whole new world.
There's the invention of LEDs, and they were just so efficient that I think that increased the amount of light we could put into a space. But then there's also the invention of the tape light, which came, I think, 15 years after the invention of the LED itself. And the invention of tape light suddenly changed the non-detail game, because we started seeing so many architectural details incorporate non-detail, like hidden, concealed hardware in a way that we hadn't seen before. So we're adding more and more light to a space, even though they're non-details, and non-details are meant to reduce our dependency on like direct light sources. But then after the tape light comes in, we start seeing ourselves use it because it's cool, and then we can hide it anywhere in the space. And then there's the pixel control, so that's introduced, and now LEDs not only are efficient and tiny, but they're also dynamic. They can move, they can change colors, and I think like that again shifts how we respond with lighting design. So I feel like it's actually, we've had multiple like reinvention of lighting design even within LEDs.
The non-detail is very susceptible to that transition from lighted object, or from light as object to lighted object. And that is seen in things like socket shadows or sections that are out. There's the non-detail creates or is intended to create the effect of a perfectly continuous surface, whether it's, lighting a wall as this beautiful architectural expression or a ceiling, But as soon as you can see those socket shadows, as soon as you can see any defects in that continuity, it sort of pulls you out of that sort of higher order expression of architectural form making into the pragmatics of, well, there's 4-foot T8s in there and there's a socket shadow and you're seeing discolorations and all these things. And so these details, which we try and use as a way of sort of dematerializing architecture, can almost have the inverse effect when they're not executed perfectly or they can't be maintained as intended.
How does the manufacturers of the ultimate, equipment investigate that need as opposed to just react to that need?
We could do effective lighting design with
Just less.
with very relatively simple hardware, but done with creative architectural detailing, with creative placement and design of luminous environments. You don't need 12,000 different types of slot products that meet every single potential option in order to do good work.
Inherently looking for soft concealed lighting, right? Like, so even if like there's this trend on TikTok where people say never use the big lights, I never turn on the big lights, and as designers we're creating like these residences where we do give them the big lights even though that's not what they want, and then they buy different hardware and then create their own lit environments that are comfortable to them, and then when you look across the spectrum they're all very similar. And I think,
can you describe a couple of those similarities?
Like for example, like in all residences, people light the corners with soft lights that are shielded in a shade, or they're hidden behind furniture. There's this famous like the Philips hue behind a TV that's become very commonplace now in homes. There's the teenagers who line their rooms, like the ceilings, with the string light, like that imitates a cove, and it's always color changing, and there's just so much color in how they perceive spaces. They don't sit in white light spaces like how we do. So there's a trend towards thinking of colored light as part of how someone perceives the night sky. And I guess like what I'm trying to say is, even though there's a technology and there are people implementing it, individually, like people always gravitate towards just soft, warm, simple lighting, and that's what they want ultimately, that they can control and personalize to their to the way they respond to the space. And I think, no matter how much we keep evolving lighting design, there's always going to be a need to go back to less. So we can give someone like 8 layers of light in a space, but ultimately they just want to use the ones that make sense to them. And I think where we are right now is we have the technology, so we just give it. And then is it necessary?
All of a sudden, you have an awareness. You mentioned TikTok in the modern day, but before social media existed, nobody could share their user preferences, right? Before blogs and forums existed, you were still limited to the conversations that basically you had in person. Like there was no mass sharing of information.
Well, no,
that's what the expositions were.
Yeah, the expos and also magazines, periodicals. That was the way in which the
rate that happened and being able to get into that and everything else
exponential
was still just so finite and to an extent largely curated.
Very curated, yes.
The market for light fixtures explodes because there's all this opportunity to innovate, to create, and
this is the everything everywhere all at once.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're here.
Yeah.
Right? We're in the modern era of LED. Let's call it 2014.
There you go.
Okay. 2014.
Lines of light. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it'll be great to like interview manufacturers and have their perspective of how they saw the technology shift. But I feel like from the lens of non-details, tape lights changed like became both an innovation but also a problem, right? Like suddenly we were able to stretch fixtures for like miles. We had access to remote drivers that you could place anywhere on a project. So then the architecture responded to it by saying, sure, like you can put a detail anywhere. Like we started seeing every reception desk being front lit, toe kick details, stair treads being illuminated individually. And that, I think that led to just too much light. Just because it was exciting, it was possible. And I think also the size of the fixtures just started getting smaller and smaller. We have tape lights that are like less than half an inch now that you can use in a project. And I think that led to a lot of architects thinking that all they need to do, but the effect of light didn't change. Light still needs a certain dimension. It still needs to be placed in a certain way. It needs certain materials for it to reflect and achieve its full potential. So even though the fixtures have gotten smaller, the effects really have stayed the same. And I think like the architects responded to these mini fixtures by creating mini details. And then now when we work on projects, they think that giving us a 4-inch pocket is like more than enough to efficiently light a ceiling.
Problem there too, a totally unintended consequence, right? It's easy to just develop all these miniaturized products.
Right.
People see it and creatively think, oh, well, I can just stick this there. Whoever has that product is going to do whatever they need to do to incentivize people to utilize that.
Right.
And manufacturing really, I should say manufacturing and manufacturers' reps, like almost became overpowering to the fact like, oh, look at this cool new thing. Oh, look at this cool new thing. Boom, 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 boom. Shiny object, shiny object, shiny object. Meanwhile, there's a suite of, I don't know, 1,000 lighting designers. We're trying to learn about all this because your reputation's on the line if you start recommending this stuff. What's the timeline in terms of like all this stuff going out into the market and then a real design conversation happening around what we should think about when we're using this versus tape lights everywhere?
Well, I mean, I think that's something that we're trying to bring to the table here. We're hardly the first ones. I mean, I was in doing some of this research, found an article that Chip Israel wrote for Architectural Lighting magazine online, where he is mostly talking about details from the perspective of technical execution, like how to detail a cove, and so the act of detailing as opposed to the detail itself. And he has a great little quip at the end that says, just because you can make them smaller doesn't mean you should. I think, there's this, in this race to the bottom for miniaturization, like what Srushti was mentioning, like there's this knee-jerk reaction that we can make the whole detail smaller, but in fact, like just because the source gets smaller and more diminutive doesn't mean that the detail can in order to do the luminous work that's needed of it. When you stick a fixture 2 inches from a wall surface, you're going to get a very discrete line of light up at the top unless you've got really good graze optics on it, and then you're going to graze the wall with a very hard graze, whether that source is 4 inches wide or a half an inch wide. Actually, that's not true. If the source is a half an inch wide, it's going to be very sharp.
And then we go from this, in the design process, we go from this idea of necessity to like negotiation, right? Coves and slots and planes, these are necessary to provide visually comfortable, luminous environments where people can feel safe and can perform their tasks and feel inspired. But it goes from there to like then us negotiating this detail. Okay, you can only give us 6 inches because there's an AV or like a HVAC pipe like going through the ceiling. Fine, we'll find a tape light. Like no, and then we forget the plot is lost because we're still trying to preserve the detail versus trying to preserve the effect of the light.
But this actually isn't the only way. Like Europe doesn't seem to have the same kind of fascination or sort of fetishization, with integrated lighting. Like when I started working as a lighting designer, like integrated lighting was this pinnacle of lighting design expression because most spaces weren't integrated, but it's gotten to the point where, it's over the top, like Srushti was saying. But, what we're the luminous experience or the luminous effect doesn't need to be created with a negative detail. It doesn't need to be a hidden pocket to softly light a wall with a concealed source. Like you could still put surface mounted fixtures where you're seeing the object in a neutral fashion or even an aesthetically present fashion, and it's still doing the similar luminous work. Same thing with a series of indirect wall sconces to uplight a ceiling as opposed to a concealed cove.
Right. And I think what's happening, like LEDs are so efficient that you can put a ton of them in a space and still reach energy code requirements. But then when you're starting to use these non-details as like ornaments or just using them because you can in a space, then you still have to add supplemental lighting to actually perform the task at hand. So we end up using way more fixtures than we require in a space. And then if we go back to what Dan was saying, which is the original intent to light the space well, then that can be achieved by just one layer of light, and that means seeing the visible hardware.
What has made all of this research, worth it for you in terms of like how it now maybe helps you and other people that can listen to this to understand, again, not the right word, but for the sake of this conversation, combat the bullshit.
Yeah,
can we spend 5 minutes here just kind of like really juicing up that part of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are currently guilty of everything that we pointed out, right? Just because there is technology available and the excitement of being able to make these non-details work in our designs, I think we get caught up in like, oh, we have a stair tread that's made from wood millwork. It's so easy to integrate a line of light over there. But like, did we have to do that in the first place? Like, won't we get the same effect by just putting like 2 downlights in the ceiling to like highlight the whole staircase? So I think this whole like research has been a really good way for us to recenter, like kind of think about why we like find meaning and why we are dedicated lighting professionals in the first place. And I for sure have been taking a step back on all my projects and being like, okay, like, yes, I'll put layers of light where possible, but let me like switch it off and see what's enough in a space.
I think a lot of it for me is recentering back on the concepts of perception-based lighting and not just, to what Srushti mentioned, not just using non-details for the sake of doing them or because it's easy. Like when you're quickly having to put together a lighting design package and you're, in Revit, you got not a lot of time to get things out, you need to quickly do things. It is easier to stretch a wall slot along a wall than it is to space out incremental wall washers, right? Because all you have to do with a wall slot is stick it up against the wall and stretch it out, and you don't have to worry about the spacing. You don't have to worry that the architect's going to like muck with the ceiling. You don't have to integrate with the ACT pattern. It is an easy solution in documentation, but it puts the onus on a whole host of other actors and issues. It requires integration with the architecture and is that material the right material to be lighting? Is that wall surface should be highlighted? Did the fire protection engineer stick a big ass strobe on that wall? And in fact, it doesn't want to be a lighted wall.
And we are putting pressure on manufacturers to then respond to these types of installations, right? Like I don't think fixtures are meant to be pulled for like 50 feet linear without, and we do see the flaws of putting that kind of pressure executed in space.
I mean, what's funny about like prefabricated cove and slot products is there's this huge proliferation of them in the market in 2024. Not a single one of them is visible when the architecture is done. If the product is done right, it could just as easily be a fully architectural detail with a bare strip up there or a piece of tape light, or it could be a completely constructed product. There is no intended visual difference between a fully constructed product and a light source in an architectural detail. And so in a way, it's kind of funny and ironic that there are so many products available for a detail that is a non-detail, you know?
I do know. Like, cool. I do know. There's light fixtures that are prefab but require a little bit of construction around it. Then there's light fixtures that get placed in something that is completely built in the field. That's tape light, that's slot light with regression on it, and then it's totally prefab things that may or may not have an integrated lighting component to it.
Right.
What gives, right? Why do all of those exist? How are they supposed to be competitive? How are they supposed to innovate that?
But why does it need integration, innovation? Like, I think one of the fallacies here is the fallacy of development, right? Like, Bill Lamb had a great quote from his book that it was basically like, we don't need more technology and we don't need more light. What we need is people to understand the principles of perception and how to apply the lighting technologies already at our disposal. He said this in the 70s. And the fact is that, like, to create a high quality cove, to your example, can be done with any technology and any detail source if done correctly.
So why do people keep reinventing that wheel?
Capitalism.
Good fucking question, Sam.
Capitalism.
Yes. Hashtag capitalism.
Yeah. It's like there's so much rush to just respond to a technological development, right? Like nobody waits and like critically thinks about what this means for human perception, what this means for sustainability. No one questions it. And like these spaces that we design, they don't even last like over time, right? Like they're fit outs that are like changed every 5-10 years, and then these miles of hardware that we've used are just thrown, and then we start again. We start with a new set of fixtures and still do the same solutions. So I think it'll be great for us all to like just take a step back and be more intentional with why we're like, does a particular manufacturer need to come up with a new fixture every week? Like, this is not freaking Forever 21, right? Like it, and they just keep showing us every year when we go to trade shows, there's like the new version of the same fixture that we're using again and again and again.
That is the thing, right? There's so many manufacturers out there and everybody wants a piece of the market share. The market is growing because we are still building and like we're also remodeling what's been built and everything. But the market isn't necessarily growing at a rate that the manufacturing options are growing in terms of the number of manufacturers. You can't help but, say I have an idea and a vision on how to operate this business and I'm going to make money and, take market share here or there. We know that there's a wholesale channel that introduces the need for healthy competition on that, right? But it doesn't need to be excessive. And I would argue that while that wasn't the intent, it's become that way because as you've laid out for us, there's basically like 3 big ways or concepts or non-details that are used, whether it's a lighting designer, an architect, or anyone saying put light in a space, right? Everybody finds their edge for it. But what we really need to do is stop searching for the tiny little edge to say, look, I'm the shiny barracuda, come over here, and say, well, let's just simply respond to the simplest, let's respond to the simplistic need and take a holistic approach to, how this solution ultimately lives. Well, and that can include, to your point, Srushti, longevity. Like,
right.
You could argue, you need 3 or 5 of everything to have healthy market competition, but then you also, need something to be engineered to never be serviced or to be serviced, every 5 years, or it's it's 100% being tossed and recycled 4 years from now. Like the recyclability and replaceable components don't matter if you know the life cycle of that thing is 5 years. Like it just needs to be able to be deconstructed and taken away versus something that is going to live in an institutional building that's going to be 200 years old and isn't going to have funding to be completely replaced.
Well,
right?
I think to that
And
point,
people get, I'll let you fire up, but people get distracted by what that incremental value they're adding is, and they just start trying to chase the whole market. And next thing you know, you are literally walking around a trade show, or you're better yet sitting at your desk, or my favorite in the modern world, on your 17th Zoom meeting where somebody's holding something up to a camera and you're like, why am I here? You know, it's just, I guess I never would have thought that our conversation would end at this place, but it makes me really, really, really
sad,
fascinated, fired up, and pissed off that there isn't more that is thought about when it comes to what I like to call the social responsibility of good lighting. Like people are so driven to develop product for the sake of developing product, for the sake of
and then the solutions are just developing more products, right? So when we're talking about sustainability, they're like, here's a sustainable fixture, but the true nature of sustainability is to not to have that fixture in your project in the first place. Just do less.
I asked one of my coworkers about when to use an integrated lighting detail and when to use a manufactured product detail for a non-detail. You know, so a pre-constructed slot versus an architectural slot. And he said, if the space is more than $25 a square foot, you better be detailing yourself. And what I took from that, and now in our conversation, what I'm realizing is like
$25 a square foot is cheap, expensive.
That's reasonable. That's a reasonable quality for lighting. Yeah, like, you know, a typical office might be $10 to $12 a square foot. But the most sustainable detail is one in which the detail can exist independent of whatever manufacturer's thing is in there, right? You know, if that slot is going to last 50, 100, 200 years, well, maybe X manufacturer isn't going to be around then, and you want to be able to stick something else in there, versus if you've got a pre-constructed manufactured product that...
If the messy situation of what we'll just call too many options would stand up and advocate for the actual intent and purpose behind why that version of it was developed, it then go find that opportunity versus trying to put it everywhere for the sake of capturing it, they'd actually probably win and succeed because they'd find that focus. And whether it was through this designer or that project or this market or that channel, instead of, you know, trying, finding and failing, you just win and win.
I think to your other question about like what else do manufacturers need to do, I think, and this is a conversation that I think is happening more and more, but what's the most ubiquitous light source out there? It's the A19 screw base light bulb. It evolved from incandescent into LED and maintained its course. Well, the fluorescent tube actually is still quite prevalent in the rest of the world. No, in LED retrofits. Yeah. And there is a lot to be said for a non-manufacturer based module that can last the test of time. And I think in our race to LED, the race to fully integrated sources has sort of lost the forest for the trees and created this.
We've created a huge problem.
Yeah, and then the patenting, right? Like every
Exactly.
manufacturer ends up like taking ownership and patenting a certain product that then you can't, it's not accessible to us anymore. And this is like a supply demand issue, right? Which is why we're trying to like talk about this. Like it also, we can't like put the onus on just the manufacturers. I think as lighting designers, we need to be more intentional. Like if we are specifying 50,000 feet of a product, then we are also part of the problem. I think we need to take a step back as designers and really think about our spaces, be critical, intentional with why we are putting a light fixture. And then if we are only using 5 fixture types in our project, then that's going to reflect on the manufacturing industry too. So yeah, I mean, we can keep telling manufacturers should take more responsibility, but we should as well, and architects.
Your two in the moment right now takeaways from how you feel about all this, each one of you. I get my two too, so it's gonna be 6.
Okay, Dan goes first.
Well, my first takeaway is what I said before, that like I am committed to be intentional about the use of non-details in my practice and to detail them as long-term installations and not the fad of product-based installation. I'm really interested in Eric Mendelsohn, man. He was such an interesting guy. And there's a whole other thread of his coming to America and learning and designing synagogues. My mom grew up going to one of his synagogues in St. Louis, and it's just a very fascinating history to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess like my takeaway from all this is to confront the architect more. I think I personally have become complacent and just going along. If there's a render that shows 5 layers of light, I'm trying to figure out how to make that work. And I think, I would like to take a step back and like try to tell the architect, like, hey, like stop right there. These are the consequences of this decision in terms of sustainability, in terms of longevity of this project. So I think, pointing out more often, more frequently in my own practice is, something that I want to be more aware of as I go forward. I've already started like putting in presentations where the architect wants us to uplight a building. I'll add a note that says, note, uplighting is actually really bad for even though like that means the architect has to look at it, be uncomfortable, and then say, we still want it in a project. So I've started becoming more intentional about that. And then the other thing is, not try to go towards that shiny new object. So when I see a new product in the market that seems cool, like I want to take a step back and then think about design and like if I really need it in a project. Am I doing it because it's cool and I want to test it out and I see how it looks, or am I doing it because it actually is in service of my lighting design application? So I think those are the 2 like critical thoughts that I want to like keep reminding myself every day when I practice.
My turn.
Yeah.
All right, 2 takeaways. I would say the first takeaway is that lighting fundamentally has not changed in terms of why we need it. But, and we can learn a lot about our current mindset around it by reflecting on the past. And you've shown that today. It's easy to want to innovate and learn and pour on top of whatever exists, but there's Newton's famous laws and they apply to everything still today, and lighting's no different. And I don't think I've ever stopped to slow down to be like there's a set of fundamental research and kind of like when the practice of the profession was founded that we really should just stand true to. And if the industry would stand up and challenge for that, as opposed to sit back and watch the wild ride, we'd maybe control ourselves a little bit more. And that's going to benefit everybody that's involved. The side note to that takeaway is like, everybody's trying to build a lot of stuff as cheap and as fast as possible. That's a short-term gain, and it's gonna literally probably all burn up. This is a first of its kind on our platform at Light-Eye and the Light Pod. It's what I would just call going deep and really getting into things and sitting down for 2 hours to put out a set of thoughts that can then be formulated into what is as streamlined as possible, but also is intentionally in a format this way that allows people to be here with us in the room, even if they're not. And I would just encourage everyone to, whether you do this with another peer or colleague, think about how you can carve out time for this, because the critical thinking is really what makes that change happen. So thank you. Thank you to both of you. And if you've made it to the end, high five. I just have one like personal question, and it's like, let me know, let Dan and Srushti know how you feel about this if you've made it to the end. And how we might be able to continue doing this
Oh yeah,
to help and support our industry.
We will have an email set up by the time that this airs, non-detail@lampartners.com.
Okay. So
We'll drop it in the show notes.
So yeah. So if you have questions and you want to take 2 hours and make it 6 hours, we'll drop an email address in the show notes, but it'll be non-detail@lampartners.com, and
yeah, we have the dumb.
you'll get an answer. First person to email with a reference to the light pod in the subject wins a special prize from me.
Oh.
And it's not just a bag of Twizzlers.
Well, I hope it's a mini version of a mini cove.
You guys, thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is fun. We'll do it again.
You betcha.
But until then, hasta la vista.